In 1970, the book Future Shock put Alvin Toffler on the map as a serious futurologist. His new book, Revolutionary Wealth, written with his wife Heidi, takes a look at the 21st century. The Tofflers argue that the United States is spearheading a new civilization, but that corporations, government, and social institutions left over from an era of mass production are not keeping up with this rapidly changing world. Alvin Toffler discusses his book with former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich. As a young assistant professor at West Georgia State College in the early 70s, Newt Gingrich began working with the Tofflers. He often referred to their work during his political career, and even put Toffler books on his required reading list for members of Congress and all Americans.
It's a personal thrill for me to have a chance to spend an hour talking with you, and I think we owe it to our viewers to share a little bit about how long we've known each other. But I want to say, going into this, we're going to talk about Revolutionary Wealth, your new book, your extraordinarily important contribution to thinking about the 21st century. But in my mind and in my lifetime, that book really stands on top of a contribution to thinking around the world. Future Shock in 1970, the Third Wave in 1980, Power Shift in 1990. And I can say personally, both as a college teacher when I first met you, then as a member of Congress, and then as Speaker of the House, that the number of people I know whose lives were changed because in Future Shock you told them the world really was going to change dramatically. In the Third Wave you began to explain how it was going to change. And in Power Shift you set the beginnings of an institutional framing. So I look forward for, as soon as I knew we could do this together, Al, the fact that you and Heidi have now produced Revolutionary Wealth and continued to show people how the 21st century will evolve. But why don't you for a minute first, if we might be personal. I remember having read Future Shock, being very excited, and then as a young teacher at West Georgia College, coming, I believe, to Chicago.
Yes.
And why don't you pick it up from there for a minute?
Well, it was a conference, I believe, of the American Council of Education, and I was going. Future Shock was a bestseller by then, and I was speaking, and you came up to me afterwards, and of course you weren't dressed the way you are dressed now, and your hair was different, and you were wearing different glasses, and you were in the style of the 70s, shall we, 60s and 70s, shall we say, and we met perfunctorily, I thought at first, and then we met again in 1975. We were asked by two Democratic, one senator and one congressman, to stage a meeting on Capitol Hill that would talk to the members of Congress about the future. And so Heidi and I agreed to do that, and we started to organize that, and we made lists of people who would come, and the lists were almost entirely Democrats. And so the question, isn't there a Republican who futurist someplace? Somebody said, well, there's this guy Gingrich in Georgia. And then and we got in touch with you, and you came, and that was a day and a half, I think it was, a day and a half on Capitol Hill, and we brought together members of both parties, and it was a good experience. I'm not sure how much impact it had on the institution at that point, but that's when we first had a substantive.
Well, you know, but in that context, for just a minute, you first of all, for a young assistant professor at West Georgia College in Carrollton, it was a big deal to come to Washington to be part of that kind of group. And I think coming out of that, there was a caucus in the future. The people tend to forget. I mean, both Al Gore and I belonged to it at one point.
People forget that you and Gore both were active in that caucus.
And there was a real effort in the early 80s to think about the future in new and bold and different ways. And I know coming out of that, you had a huge impact on General Starry at the Army Training and Doctrine Command. I think it's fair to say that Japan became different because of your work. China became different. The U.S. Army became different. There was, and when we had a group who were meeting regularly, the Conservative Opportunity Society Republicans, you were very generous and came on and talked about the scale of change and talked about the ideas. And I think there was a whole generation of then younger, now not so young, political leaders who found that exciting. But you've gone and continued to build on that work. And I think this is the important thing, is that, first of all, that you have been largely right in general patterns. If anybody goes back and looks at from Future Shock to the Third Wave to power shift, there's a continuity of understanding of the future that is pretty remarkable, and that you are now building on with revolutionary wealth. But I think it would be helpful, if you don't mind, not that you're going to give away any trade secrets here, but how did you and Heidi pick up the rhythm of the future in such a profound way and begin to sense that the world was different than people around you thought it was?
I would say that actually began in the late 50s for us, when we were here in Washington and when I was covering the Hill. I somehow knew that there was something called computers out there, that they were just moving from the military and government into businesses, first big gigantic mainframes. And there were other things happening. And we actually wrote an essay called The Subterranean Revolution. And it has remained subterranean.
But can people Google it? I mean, it does exist.
No, it never was published. It was never published.
Really?
And there was good reason for it. We didn't really have it together. We didn't have the ideas yet well formulated and so forth. But we sensed basically that we're coming into a period of a lot of change, and that most people, and especially the political system, seemed unaware of it. So it was contact with Congress, actually, that probably sparked the first attempt to write this stuff. And then that was late 50s. Wound up after that going to work for Fortune magazine, which introduced us to business. We had previously had experience with unions, trade unions, and then we had a lot of contact with other parts of society and so forth, but we'd had no contact with business. And that happened when I started work at Fortune magazine, and was followed by, as soon as we left, an invitation by IBM to write a report for them on the future social and organizational implications of the computer. And I wrote that. Went out to California. I saw the big mainframes that was first random access computers, met the world's first artificial intelligencers, and was blown away by what I saw. So that was, I didn't learn, by the way, until 35 years later, that was a report for Tom Watson.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because I worked through an intermediary, an economist on their IBM staff, and 35 years later he called me and said, of course you know who that was for. I said, of course I don't.
But when you were first doing this in the mid-'60s, there's still not a general popular consensus that we're going to have the wave of change that happened.
Well, and another thing that was going on at the same time in our lives, we were writing Future Shock. We said that change was going to accelerate. That was the basic thesis, and that people might have difficulty adapting to change, and organizations would have difficulty adapting to change. And that thesis, I think, is held very clear. There are particular forecasts that we made in the book that have come to be, one or two that have not come to be. And it's interesting, looking back. For example, this was finally published in 1970. We said that there would be cloning, that we would be cloning animals and also humans. We haven't cloned humans yet, but I believe, in fact, that that's going to happen whether we wanted to or not. We made a mistake. We said by 1985. Now, where did we get 1985? How did we cook up that number? The answer is it came to us from one of the world's leading Nobel Prize-winning biologists, who was a bit more optimistic than his fellows. So the overall arguments that we made in Future Shock, I think, have held up, as you suggest, pretty well. And there were individual forecasts. We talked about the coming of cable television at a time when everybody said there'll never be cable because advertisers won't advertise on cable. It's too small. We saw the first, what was called at that time, electronic video recording. And this was all pre the digital stuff. And so we were increasingly aware of the technological changes going on.
Have you always, in that sense, since the 60s, spent a fair amount of time looking at cutting-edge technologies and talking to people who are out actually developing them? I mean, in a sense, do you spend a disproportionate amount of your time with the small and the new rather than the large and the established? How do you keep keep pulling your brain?
I would say that's the case. the only thing that I would modify there is that our interests are increasingly less technological and more social, even than they were in the past. We're not techies. We're not geeks. We are not capable of writing software. We knew that something really important was happening, that this was going to change a lot of things. So that's why it's a diversity, to try to diversify the sources of your information and the diverse life experiences.
Okay, so we are in this particular show trying to convince people that they should both read Revolutionary Wealth and sign up for the Daily Yomiuri.
Oh, Yomiuri will love this program.
Well, Japan is not a small place. But anyway, I just want to say on behalf of C-SPAN, I've never done this before. I can't imagine a time I'd rather do it than to be the interviewer for a very dear personal friend and somebody who I think has made an enormous contribution to America. And I wish you all the luck on the book tour with Revolutionary Wealth and every opportunity to continue developing new ideas and new approaches. And I hope you and Heidi have a wonderful year doing this.
And you and I can continue to argue about politics all night long.
I am confident.